Welcome everybody to the June 2015 meeting of the Mississippi PowerShell User Group. Today we have PowerShell MVP Trevor Sullivan, and he's going to present a session on creating object-oriented scripts using PowerShell classes. So take it away, Trevor.
Cool. Well, thank you everyone for having me on tonight. As mentioned, my name is Trevor Sullivan, a 2-year Microsoft MVP for Windows PowerShell now, and lately I've been doing a lot of work around PowerShell, obviously, but also around the Microsoft Azure public cloud platform. So I'm an independent consultant doing Azure infrastructure and automation work, and been doing a lot of PowerShell Desired State Configuration work, along with Mike Robbins. He's also been doing a lot of DSC work as well at his job. So really cool technology. So Microsoft's been making obviously a lot of strides with PowerShell lately. The latest PowerShell version available is actually PowerShell version 5, and there's an April 2015 preview. So it's been a couple of months since we've had a preview version come out, but hopefully Microsoft will satisfy us with a new version in the near future here. So first of all, just a quick kind of social media plug. I'm on Twitter pretty regularly. You haven't seen me on Twitter a whole lot lately because I've actually busted my phone over the weekend. So usually I'm a little bit more responsive on Twitter than I have been the past few days. But if you're not on Twitter today, make sure you sign up. Twitter is a great place to figure out what's coming out in terms of PowerShell. You'll see people like Mike Robbins out there talking all the time about the PowerShell work that he's doing. And I tweet about PowerShell and Azure and Mountains occasionally, which is one of my passions. And so you'll see me talking about a lot of these different things, and you can follow hashtags like Azure or PowerShell or PSDSC for anything that's DSC related. So Twitter's a great way just to keep connected to the community, be kind of on the cutting edge of technology, and so make sure you check that out. I've also got a website here at https://trevorsullivan.net. I've been here for a while now, blog a couple of times a month usually. So feel free to check out that and keep an eye on my articles. And then finally, I wanted to plug my YouTube videos, which are actually very related to what we're talking about tonight. Just about a week ago, I published a whole series of about six videos that talk about PowerShell version 5 classes, which is what we're going to be talking about here tonight. So feel free to check out these kind of on-demand videos. They're completely free of charge. So if you're interested in PowerShell classes, make sure you check them out. So I wanted to point out that PowerShell classes are an entirely new feature. I don't have any slides here, so everything's going to be purely demonstrative tonight. So if you go out to Google and search for WMF5, you're going to come across the April 2015 preview, which we already discussed is the latest version available. So if you go out to the Microsoft Download Center, you can grab the latest MSU or Windows Update file there. You also want to make sure you grab the handy-dandy release notes, because the release notes is where everything that you need to know about the latest release of PowerShell version 5 is going to be available. So all the information that I've gleaned and kind of compiled for this presentation and all the stuff that I've been working with is all generally contained from release notes. Now there are some gotchas here and there that I've just come across through experience and passed them into the PowerShell core team, and so there's some additional insights there. But as far as core functionality goes, just make sure that you read over the release notes. I've actually got that up here. I was actually just looking to make sure I got the syntax right for doing base classes and base class methods and stuff. So this is pretty well documented. It goes over desired state configuration features. It goes over PowerShell classes. It goes over debugging topics. A lot of useful information in here. So make sure that you install the latest version of PowerShell version 5. It's been pretty stable for me. I use it full-time on a daily basis on my Windows 8.1 machine. So yeah, it's working great. So what I wanted to talk about tonight is PowerShell classes. And classes are something that IT pros may not understand as well as full-time software developers. So what I kind of wanted to do is start out by just showing you what a software developer would generally use a class for. So let's say that we're writing an application in C#.NET. So we're going to kind of switch from PowerShell over to C#. We're going to open up Visual Studio, create a new console application project. It's pretty bare bones, just has the main method, which is kind of our main entry point to the application. So if I'm a developer and I want to write an application that manages maybe contacts. So maybe I'm managing maybe I'm writing an application to manage a list of contacts. Well, what I'm probably going to do is come into Visual Studio and actually add what's called a class to my project. And if I have a contact manager, I'm probably going to have an entity called a contact. So I'm actually going to create a new class called contact. And what you always want to think about when you're building a class is, what does my object model look like? A class is essentially a component that we can then incorporate into our applications. So if I'm writing a contact manager application, I might have a class called contact that represents the structure of what a contact would look like. So we aren't actually creating a contact, we're creating the blueprint for what a contact might look like. So a contact is generally going to have properties, and properties are basically just descriptors of that object, whatever that object may be. So our contact might have a first name property that's a string, so a person's first name. We might also have a last name property, which is also a string. We might also have an address, which could also be a string. We could also have a string called phone number, or maybe mobile number. And whatever you call these properties is completely up to you, right? Because you are the one who's actually defining the object model. So we might have some other properties that we might want to put in here, like email address or website address or Twitter handle or other types of things. But you know, I think we've got enough properties here for the sake of demonstration. So classes have not only properties which describe the object, but there's also what are called methods, which are essentially actions that you can perform on the object. So in this case, we might have a contact who has a first name, who has a last name, an address, and a mobile number, and we might have a method on there named something like call. So maybe we have a VoIP application where we can actually call one of our contacts by calling an API. And so a method is generally going to have some sort of logic inside of it that invokes some sort of process. So in this case, we're just going to put a comment here and say this method calls the contact. So we're not actually going to put any type of implementation here in this case. We're basically just putting in a comment there to say that this method would call the contact if we had some sort of API to call. So now that we've kind of built out this object model here, we can actually now go back into our application and reference that, that class. So again, the contact class is a blueprint of what our contact could potentially look like, but it's not actually a contact itself. So what we need to do is go into our application, and what we do is we instantiate the class. So we actually create a contact from the blueprint by using in C# what's called the new keyword. And then you would assign it to a variable such as, let's just call it Trevor. So we're going to say Trevor, the variable Trevor is a contact, and we're going to assign a new contact instance to that variable. So now, once we have that instance created, we can then start assigning the properties to it. And I've actually kind of messed this up, so I need to do a public class to make sure that it's visible. And for some reason, my properties are not showing up here. I'm not actually a full-time C# dev, so I'm not going to pretend that I am. But you can kind of get the idea here that a C# developer is going to build an object model and then start leveraging it from their code. So the new capability in PowerShell version 5 allows us to do something very, very similar. So PowerShell version 5, starting with the September 2014 preview, has a new class keyword. And the class can be called whatever you want. So there's an identifier that directly follows the class keyword. So inside of that class, you can, very similar to C#, you can define your properties, and the properties describe the object. And then you can have methods that actually perform some action. Now you can also have a special type of method which is called a constructor. And a constructor is called when you instantiate the object. So if we were to build this person class from the ground up, so I've already kind of implemented it here, but let's go ahead and just build it from the ground up. So we're going to build the basic structure for the class, which is simply the class keyword and the identifier for the class. We would then create properties like first name, last name, and Twitter handle. Our person, every person that we create, could potentially have a first name, a last name, and a Twitter handle. So what if we want to make sure that every single time that we create a new person, the person has a first name? We want to make sure that the person at least has a first name, right? So what we would do is we would declare what's called a constructor, and the constructor is identified by simply using the class's name. You can also have input parameters to the constructor. And so we'll declare a single input parameter called first. And then whenever this constructor is invoked, we're going to set the person's first name to the value that's passed in as the first parameter. And as you can see, we've used this special variable called this. And what this refers to is the current instance of the class that we're working with. So let's take a look at how this works. If we want to create a new person based on this blueprint of our person, what we do is we reference the class by using square brackets around it, and then we put a double colon, and you'll see that the PowerShell ISE actually prompts us with this new method. Now, because I already declared another person class in a different tab here, it's actually showing me the incorrect signature for the constructor, but if I simply pass in a single parameter, a string, as my first name for the person, I can then execute that. And you can see that an object, a person object, is emitted to the console with the first name of Trevor. You can also have multiple constructors. So if you want the person to have a first name and a last name, as soon as the object is constructed, you can create a second constructor using the same name, but it can have a different method signature. So this constructor takes 2 parameters, and this constructor takes 1. In the constructor that takes 2 parameters, we're also going to set the person's last name. So we're going to essentially initialize both the first name and the last name. And then we could even create a third one that allows us to specify the Twitter handle as soon as it's instantiated as well. Let's just call it Twitter. And this .Twitter handle equals Twitter. So now we can call person new Trevor. Let me just change over here. So if we were to run this, our constructor that we initially built with the single parameter works. However, we can also call additional constructors, such as the one that has 2 parameters. So now we get 2 objects back. We get the one with the 1 constructor, and we get this second one with the constructor that has 2 parameters. So Doug has a question, will this recording be available on demand? And I believe, Mike, the answer is yes. Correct me if I'm wrong, though, please.
Yes, normally it takes us about a week to get it published.
So in this case, I am going to actually call all three constructors, and I'm going to get three objects emitted to the console. So constructors are really cool because they allow you to basically set up the object into a usable state as soon as it's created. So if you want to make sure that every single person has a first name, last name, and Twitter handle, you could actually comment out these other constructors that we created. And then if we try to run this code, it's going to fail because there is no constructor that has a single argument. So it's complaining on line 24 that there's no constructor that takes a single argument. On line 25, it's complaining that there's no constructor that takes two arguments because we commented out both of these constructors. And then finally, we actually do get a complete object emitted because our third constructor was invoked. So we passed it in three parameters, and that's what it was expecting. So that helps us to ensure that our object is meeting the standards that we need in order to work with it. So we need every single person to have a first name, a last name, and at least a Twitter handle. So those are constructors. Now we can also implement methods. And so a method is generally some sort of action that's performed on an object. Now methods are unique compared to constructors because methods have return types. So methods can return some type of object. Now you can also tell a method to return void. And in that case, you're basically saying that the method returns no value whatsoever. You can also do a generic object return value, so you can return any type of value from that method. You can also do things like Boolean values. You can return pretty much any .NET type that you want to. So on our person class, our person might have a Boolean property called isHungry. Because people get hungry, right? Well, at least I do. I like beer, I like bacon, I like pizza. You know, I'm a pretty normal human being. So our person has a Boolean value called isHungry. And you can set an initial value for this property. So even if we don't add isHungry to our constructor here, we can basically declare a hard-coded value and say every time that we create a new person, the default value for isHungry is always going to be true. So every new person that we create is going to be hungry by default. So if I were to rerun this code down here, we still get those exceptions because of those commented out constructors. But we can see that the last person that we actually get emitted from line 30 is hungry. So let's create a method called eat. And what this method is going to do is basically going to consume food, and it's going to change the isHungry property to false. So after the person eats, he's no longer hungry. Now you'll see here that I've got a little red squiggly underneath my method, and it says not all code paths return values within the method. So what's happening here is I told this method that I'm going to return a Boolean value when it exits. However, in this case, in this implementation that I have here, I'm not actually emitting any value. And the way that you emit values from a method is using the return keyword. Now, the return keyword has been supported in PowerShell for a very long time. However, in a class, it operates very much the same way. So in a class method, we can say return, and we can return true. So what we can also do is we can put a try-catch statement in here. So if for some reason we fail to set the isHungry property to false, then we can actually return false to indicate that the method failed for some reason. So what we need to do in this case, let's get rid of those first two constructors. And let's just focus on this third constructor that we still have implemented. And let's assign that person to a variable. So right now, every time we run this script, it's actually creating a new person instance and then emitting it to the console. So let's actually capture that instance into a variable so that we can play with it after we're done constructing it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit F5, and that's going to rerun the script. And as you can see, the person is no longer being emitted because we're capturing the value into the Trevor variable. So if we simply emit the Trevor variable, we have our person here. And if we put a period after Trevor, you can see that Trevor has an eat method. And if we call eat, it's going to return either true or false because we told it that we're going to return a Boolean value. So if we simply emit Trevor again, look what happened. Is hungry changed to false. So what happens now if an error occurs? So let's say that we try to set, trying to think, if we set, let's make is hungry an integer, and let's say that it's 1 or 0. But in the method, let's say that we had a bug in our code where we actually tried to set is hungry to a string, like blah. Well, this is going to throw an exception because blah is not an integer. Blah cannot be converted to an integer. So that's going to throw an exception, and the method is going to return false instead of true. So we're going to create a new person instance, and then we're going to call the eat method. And as you can see, an exception was thrown, and so this eat method actually returned false in this case. So you can, so that's basically just a description of how you can return values from your methods. Any questions so far? Cool. So one of the other features that PowerShell classes supports is the concept of inheritance. And I think, cool, thanks Doug. Glad you find that useful. So inheritance allows us to build classes that are generic and then inherit that functionality from a child class. So what we can do, for example, is build a generic class called a vehicle. And let's say that every single vehicle has a name, right? So this is pretty straightforward, right? We can just call new vehicle, and we'll get a vehicle, right? But the vehicle doesn't have a name because there's a default constructor built into PowerShell classes that takes no arguments. And so because there's no logic actually setting the name, we're getting basically just a new generic vehicle, and the property isn't set to anything useful. So let's go ahead and implement a constructor for our vehicle class. And make sure that every single vehicle has a name. Okay, so now when we try to call this, it's going to fail because we've killed the default constructor by declaring a constructor that does have arguments. So now we have to specify a vehicle name. However, there's lots of different types of vehicles in the world, right? There's trucks, there's cars, there's ATVs, there's motorcycles, dirt bikes, and so on. And each vehicle has different types of attributes. Every vehicle has at least a name, however. So every single vehicle that we create in our program is going to have a name. But what if we had a truck class, right? So we want a truck to be a type of vehicle. So what we'll do is we'll inherit from it. Now we're going to implement a constructor for the truck that also sets the name of the vehicle. So because the truck is a type of vehicle, it's automatically going to have a name property. So Doug has a question. He says, since PowerShell can call web services, you could turn this class functionality into a tool that would then update a SharePoint list. Yeah, you could certainly do something like that. Generally, when you're building a class, you want to think of a class as some type of managed entity, right? So you want to think of it, so generally your entity might, in this case, be a SharePoint list. Your entity could also be something like a web service that you could then call methods on and interact with. You could actually build a class that basically exposes methods that essentially wrap REST APIs or SOAP APIs or something like that. So that's certainly something that you could do. Yeah, so you could declare a class called a SharePoint list, and the SharePoint list could have different properties like a name, an endpoint, a data property that contains the actual data inside the SharePoint list. And as you indicated in your message, you could have like an is updated. So is the SharePoint list up to date? It could do a comparison against your in-memory data compared to the existing data in the SharePoint list. And then if it's out of date, you could have an update method that actually commits the changes to the SharePoint list. Yeah. So that's certainly something that you could implement. So because we inherited, back to our example here, because we inherited the vehicle class from truck, the truck automatically gets this name property without us having to redefine it. We could also create another class called car and inherit from vehicle. And the car automatically gets a name as well. So if we were to come down here and instantiate a car, you can see that the car has a name property. So I think it's complaining here because because we declared this default constructor up here that has a single parameter to it, we also have to implement that inside of our car. Now, what's cool is that you can also invoke the base class's constructor. So in this case, what we're going to do with the car, rather than re-implementing this line number 5, so we've already told the constructor for a vehicle that it needs to set the name of the car or the vehicle to the name input parameter, right? So rather than duplicating that code in each of our child classes, so now we've basically redefined that same constructor over and over and over again. What we can do instead is invoke a base class method. And I'm probably going to embarrass myself here, but I think the way that you do that is by putting a colon after the constructor and then telling it that you want it to call the base class's constructor, and we're going to pass in this parameter value. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. So we basically have an empty constructor here for truck, and what we're basically telling it is take this input parameter for the truck constructor, and instead of implementing that logic to set the name inside of our truck constructor, we're actually just going to go ahead and pass it up to the base constructor up here and set the name there. So that way we can actually implement that functionality in all of our child classes without having to re-implement it in a unique way every time. So that helps deduplicate code. So we're going to create a new car called Trevor, and we're also going to create a new truck called Mike. And in this case, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't call the new method. I don't know what just happened there, but that's really weird. That actually worked. So, as you can see, I'm calling the constructor for the car. It's passing in the name. It's calling the base class constructor, and it's setting the car's name. The same thing is happening to the truck, but you can't see the difference between the truck and the car because they look the same. They both have a name property, so you can't really differentiate which one's which. So what we can do is we can start building out the logic of our child classes. So a truck might have a trailer. So let's create a new property called hasTrailer. And it'll be a Boolean property that indicates whether or not the truck has a trailer. And we'll initialize that to false. So every time that we create a new truck, it's by default not going to have a trailer. So if we hit F5, you can see that we created a new truck and it does not have a trailer. Now, instead of using a constructor or a method to change our properties on each class are also exposed publicly. So we can actually just manipulate those publicly. So let's go ahead and take that truck, instantiate it again, called Mike, and then we're going to assign that truck object to a variable called truck. So now, if we emit our truck, we can see that it's as we constructed it, but we can do truck.hasTrailer and then use the assignment operator equals and set it to true. So now, if we emit the truck, we've actually changed that property from a false to a true. So you can change properties either inside the class itself, or you can change properties externally. Now, another really cool thing that you can do is you can add PowerShell validation attributes to your properties. So let's say that vehicles only can have names that start with T. So if you're familiar with some of the PowerShell validation attributes, I want to say it's help about validation. I forget what the help topic is, but there's a help topic that talks about PowerShell validation attributes. And about functions advanced parameters, maybe? Okay, that's not it. Sorry, I don't know where that's at. But anyway, one of the attributes that we can declare is called validate pattern. And so validate pattern allows us to specify a regular expression that the value will be validated against. So in regular expression terminology, the little caret there basically means that the string must start with whatever follows it. So in this case, we're going to say that our string has to start with a T. So if we come back down here and we try to create a new truck called Mike, what's going to happen is our truck constructor is going to get called. It's going to pass in that name to the base class constructor. The base class constructor is going to attempt to assign the input parameter to the property called name. And what's going to happen is it's going to try to validate that against the validate pattern attribute here. And as we can see, it fails. It throws an exception. It says exception setting name on line number 6, which is right here. So it failed to set the name property of the vehicle to Mike because it doesn't match this regular expression. Now we can also do there's another validation attribute called validate set. And in that case, you can actually hard code values. So you could say Mike, you could say Trevor, you could say Bob, you could say Duncan, right? So now we're validating against a specific set. And if we hit F5 to run this again, you can see that it succeeds. So our variable truck was successfully created because Mike is inside of this set. But what happens if we try to create Mike2? Well, as you can see, the argument Mike2 does not belong to the set Mike, Trevor, Bob, and Duncan. Ah, thank you, Mike. That helps. So the validation attributes that we were looking for is under the help topic about functions advanced parameters. Another thing that we can do is in PowerShell classes is there's a new keyword called enum. So an enumeration in .NET terminology basically is just a set of values that we want to validate against. It actually is, in some ways, it's very, very similar to the validate set attribute. However, with enumerations, we also get Intellisense. So let's say that the truck has a trailer, right? And then separately, we'll have a property of type trailer type, which is our enumeration up here, and we'll just call the property trailer type. So basically what we're saying is that our truck class has a property called trailer type, and the type of that property is our enumeration up here. So whenever we try to set this property, it's going to validate it against the values that are inside of our enumeration. So we might have different types of trailers, like a box trailer, or an oil tanker trailer, or custom. So these are a few different types of trailers that you might find on a truck. So if we go back down here to our example, and we say truck dot trailer type, that should be showing up in Intellisense, but it's not yet. So truck.trailer type equals Bob. So let's actually fix Mike to be correct. So now, as you can see, we've created a new truck. We've set the has trailer property to false. But when we hit line number 32, we try to set the trailer type to Bob. Okay? Well, Bob cannot successfully be converted to a type of trailer. And in the exception message, it actually tells you what the valid values are from that .NET enumeration. So there's a box type trailer, an oil tanker trailer, and a custom trailer. And there's a couple of different ways that you can specify that. You can specify it as a string, and what PowerShell will do, or .NET will do, is it'll implicitly convert the string to the enumeration type. So it'll basically say, does the enumeration have a value that matches that string? Yes, it does, so I'm going to return that value. So, but technically, the property on the truck is still technically of type enumeration. It's not a string, it's an enumeration value. So if we were to rerun this and set it to a string, you'll see that it's successful. So if we just emit our truck to the console, you can see that the truck's name is Mike, and it says it doesn't have a trailer even though it does. Let's just fix that there. And the trailer's type is oil tanker. Now, you might say, well, how do you know to type oil tanker? Well, there's a couple of ways that I know. One is if it throws an exception, it shows me the valid values for that enumeration. But what's also really cool about enumerations is that you get Intellisense in the PowerShell ISE. So if I were to put my enumeration inside of square brackets and then put a double colon after that, you can see that I actually get this Intellisense here that shows me all the values that I've declared on that enumeration. So now, instead of doing an implicit conversion from a string to the enumeration value itself, I'm actually directly setting the value to one of my enumeration values. And as we can see, that works successfully. Sorry, I thought we had a question there. So that essentially just really discusses high-level PowerShell classes. One more thing that I wanted to talk about, and I need to check this out really quick in the handy-dandy documentation here, is that in addition to calling base constructors, we can also call base methods. So I just need to figure out what the syntax for that is exactly. If anybody knows, feel free to chime in. Oh, yes, I remember. So what we need to do is if we declare let's declare on our vehicle class a method called drive, and it'll return void. And what the drive method is going to do is it's going to take the mileage of the vehicle. We're going to add a mileage property here. And we're also going to take an input value, which is mileage. And when we call the drive method, we're going to set the mileage and increment it by the mileage that's passed in as a parameter. So we're basically going to say this vehicle's mileage is going to be incremented by the mileage that's passed in as a parameter. So on our truck method, we can also declare a drive method. Now, this method has already been declared on our base class, but we're also implementing it in the child class. And what we can do is, again, very similar to the constructors. Rather than basically copying and pasting this code that increments the mileage, what we can do is call the base class's drive method so that we don't have to re-implement it. So we can do some custom, truck work here. And then after we're done doing our custom truck work, we can simply say, well, I want you to call the vehicles method called drive. And then I'm just going to pass in the mileage that was passed into the truck's drive method. So again, rather than copying and pasting this code that implements the drive method up here, we're basically just going to cast the truck to a generic vehicle, and then we're going to call the drive method on the base class. So let's go ahead and test this code out, because I feel like maybe I screwed it up. So we're going to create a new truck called Mike. We're going to tell it that it has a trailer. We're going to set the trailer type to a box trailer. And then let's just see what happens now. So as you can see, our mileage is initialized to 0. We have our truck with a trailer and a trailer type. But now, what happens if we call the drive method? So let's drive 10 miles. So we hit F5 and we rerun that. And if we explore the truck, you can see that the mileage has been incremented to 10. So even though we called the truck's drive method right here, what actually happened is we called the base class's drive method, which ultimately incremented the mileage from 0, which is the default mileage, to the value that we passed in as a parameter. So what we can do is, in the same way on the car, we can copy and paste that drive method. And so a car will now work exactly the same way as a truck. So if we hit F5 here, and then we emit our car to the console, you can see that by simply copying and pasting this base class invocation into the car class, we've achieved exactly the same functionality as the truck, because both trucks and cars are both vehicle types. But as you can see, the car does not have a trailer. Only trucks have trailers. The car doesn't have a trailer type either. The car simply does not have any type of trailer whatsoever. But both of these classes are inheriting from our vehicle base class. So that covers pretty much all the core functionality of PowerShell classes. I'm at about 45 minutes here, and that's pretty much what I was targeting time-wise. There's also the ability to use PowerShell classes to develop DSC resources, but that's kind of a complex topic that I think would take another hour or so to go over. So if anybody has questions at this point, I would be more than happy to entertain them. Does anybody find this useful besides Doug?
I find it useful.
Cool. Were you familiar with classes before, Ron?
Yeah, somewhat. I haven't used them much in PowerShell. About a month ago, I made a DSC resource using them because I hadn't used them at all in PowerShell. But I've used them in C# a good bit.
Oh, perfect. Cool. So actually, so it's good that you mentioned the DSC stuff, though, because there is actually a bug in the April 2015 preview of PowerShell, where if you develop, I don't know if you've seen this, Ron, but if you develop multiple class-based DSC resources and you try to import multiple class-based DSC resources into a configuration document, there's actually a bug that will throw exceptions and basically say that, I think it says that the class doesn't exist or something, or it can't find the DSC resource. Have you ever tried to import multiple class-based resources, Ron?
No, I mean, so the one I was making, I didn't actually use it in production or anything. It was one of those where it was kind of a proof of concept. So I was just importing the one custom resource.
Okay. Yeah, so this bug here out on Microsoft Connect, it's kind of a weird title. It doesn't really quite make sense because I didn't fully understand the issue when I reported it originally. But basically, I went through for a customer project, actually, and developed multiple class-based DSC resources. And when you use the import DSC module or import DSC resource command inside your configuration block, if you specify multiple class-based resources, it pretty much just dies. And I believe that Microsoft has fixed, yeah, so back a couple of weeks ago they said that they fixed this. So hopefully if you're doing DSC configuration documents and you're developing custom DSC resources specifically using PowerShell classes, just be aware that this is an issue as of the April 2015 build. Okay. So what I did for my customer as a workaround was to actually convert those class-based DSC resources back into the old MOF/PSM1 format.
Yeah.
Doug says, can you embed the classes into a web form that you fill out with a PowerShell backend, and then the form gets submitted or emailed? So Doug, I think theoretically that might be possible. There's this product out there. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. It's like an ASP PowerShell add-on that basically allows you to invoke PowerShell inside of ASP. I don't remember who makes that. I want to say it's like N Software. Oh yeah, N Software. So there's this old product called PowerShell ASP. I don't even know if it's still supported. Apparently it's not because it took me to some parked domain page. But yeah, this company called N Software used to make this PowerShell ASP thing that allows you to basically execute PowerShell and emit HTML and stuff like that. So you might want to see if that's still out there, but it's probably not supported anymore. Yeah, it looks like it's completely gone. Well, that's all I've got. Thanks everybody for attending.